Welcome to the ongoing series of archival interviews at the Warren Alpert Medical School of Brown University. Today it's our honor to be with Dean Eliadashi, the Dean of Biological Sciences. We'll ask him for his full title and name. The date is June 16th, 2008. We are sitting in the Dean's office at 97 Waterman, the Arnold Laboratory at Brown University. Dean Adashi, first of all, thank you for allowing us to interview you.
Delighted.
How would you like to be addressed, formally and then informally on the tape?
Informally, please.
Okay. Last time when we met, you told us a little bit about how you'd arrived at Brown. I don't know if you could just retrace briefly what brought you to the deanship here.
Well, I was a chair of a department prior to coming to Brown for about 8 or 9 years. And that capped, in a sense, a 30-year career in women's health. I knew that in the time remaining, I wanted to do something else, but it still had to be in the context of academic medicine. And so seeking or responding to inquiries regarding decanal positions was something I decided to undertake. It just so happened that Brown was looking for a permanent dean at the time. As these things transpire, a headhunter called one day and asked whether I was interested in exploring this opportunity. I said I'd be happy to, not thinking too much about it at the time, not knowing a whole lot about Brown either at the time, frankly. I've been through Providence probably several times, but really just driving through years back when I was living in Boston. And I may have given grand rounds here once at Women and Infants Hospital. But frankly, I knew relatively little about the university and or the medical school. Although as soon as I began to focus on the school in the context of the process, turned out that a lot of people I knew were alums of the school, including alums of the medical school. Some colleagues in my own institution at the time declared themselves as Brown alums. I had no idea that they, in fact, went to school here. So obviously I picked up on Brown as I went. This was a national search. I don't really know how many candidates they began with. It was the typical process with a so-called airport interview in Boston in a hotel. I remember that well, which seemed to have gone well. I remember a few of the things that were asked. I remember a few of the things that I said. Those are impressionable moments. But you never really know until after the fact whether or not things went in the right direction. But I was then called back for more interviews, and I came down here, visited once or twice, met you on at least one or both of those occasions. And at some point, the offer was made. So it was an interesting process, which I have never really gone through before. At the time, I was very focused on really healthcare management as a career. I was in school, as you may know. I went back to the Harvard School of Public Health to earn a degree, a master level degree in healthcare management. And I was simply very interested in what was going on at the time in terms of patient safety, healthcare quality, and other issues related to healthcare in the U.S. And so I was in some way heading in a different direction when Brown called. So in a sense, it was a surprise and somewhat of a detour at the time, whether or not I will revisit healthcare, is uncertain.
Tell us about your entry into Brown, your arrival, the first few weeks and months.
Well, the provost at the time, Bob Zimmer, felt it was extremely important that I arrive on the scene promptly. Things, according to him, were in such dire state that there was no room for delay. I actually remember being on call still, taking night call in-house, Christmas of 2004, and being expected on the job here sometime on January the 10th or thereabouts of '05. In essence, my wife and I packed and left in the span of, and moved in, I suppose, in the span of about 3 weeks in the dead of winter. If you recall, we had an incredible snowstorm at the time. This is now January '05, 7 feet or so. And it's in the midst of all of that we arrived here. So that was tricky in many ways, in many, many ways. Other than that, it was a merry-go-round I don't wish on anybody. Those first few weeks, in fact, those first few months, maybe that first year, is an immersive experience, sometimes likened to drinking from a large faucet. Very difficult to actually keep all the information straight. And it's a little bit like orientation to medical school, I imagine, or to residency program, when you are bombarded by information, but really find it difficult to keep it all straight. And it was a different medical school in so many ways. Being on the grounds of a college was an unusual experience for me. I always was in health sciences centers. There was no medical school building. There were just lots of buildings that collectively made up campus. It was an urban campus, again, a little different than what I came from. So there was a lot of adjusting to do, incredible amount of adjusting to do, in fact. So it's a challenging transition. I could probably go on that one, but
Well, I'm wondering
these are
you mentioned
personal recollections.
Any early surprises or early lessons?
I think the first surprise was the realization that the organization, and most importantly, the financial management of the graduate program, was in need of work. I didn't really know about that in advance, and really did not have a sense of what the issues were. But it was financially speaking, an untenable situation that needed to be dealt with. And it emerged sometime in February. So I came in January, and in February I knew there was a real issue here that needed to be attended to. And while I clearly knew something about graduate school in the sense that I had graduate students I mentored in the graduate school. I lived with scientists all my life. The nitty-gritty were nevertheless new information that I really had to master relatively quickly. It was a very intensive period of weeks during which we put our arms around the issues and crafted a brand new policy, which we announced probably still in February of '05, which attempted to codify a new steady state in that arena. And I think was an essential move in retrospect that combined with the recruitment, well, combined with the establishment of an office for graduate and postdoctoral studies and the recruitment of Nancy Thompson to head it, I think put the postgraduate education here on a very different footing, financially and otherwise. When I came, there were very few training grants. There was no incentive for anybody to obtain them because there was no accounting for the funds that were being dispensed by the division. And the support was such that it, in many cases, was provided over 5 years or more. There were many other issues that are not critical, perhaps, to discuss. The point is, this really required attention. We took decisive action, and I think if you look today at the program, it's wonderfully funded. There's a substantial number of training grants, a growing number of fellowships, substantial number of scholarships that really buttress now this program in a way that wasn't possible at the time. So while it's one of many facets of what transpired, I think that was in the spirit of surprises or first discoveries, things you weren't apprised of, and that probably nobody in the leadership was fully aware of. I mean, you had to be here, hands-on, ask inquisitive questions, and go from there.
Any other elements, experiences, surprises stand out from meetings from the first few months?
What stands out is a sense of disenfranchisement and disappointment and unhappiness that was verbalized by most constituencies I met, from medical students to faculty to graduate students to staff. It was as if there was an endless series of issues that needed to be addressed. My first meeting was, in fact, my very first meeting, I guess, upon arrival, was with the medical students, specifically with the Medical Students Senate. So 4 or so medical students, who I still remember very well and by name, some of whom graduated this year, of course, one of whom is away doing a master degree at the Kennedy School at Harvard, but will graduate next year. I was at the Westin for dinner, and I, as was the case for the months that followed, received an earful about what was wrong with the medical school. And the same would be true of virtually anybody else I met over the next several months. I mean, I had a sense of it even during the interviews. I remember sitting at the small room at University Hall where I think I must have met you, with a group of medical school faculty who were extremely unhappy about a whole series of issues. And I remember saying, let's take those issues one at a time, and let's think about the first of them, let's say. And let's say we discussed that, and I said at the end, this seems like an administrative issue. Doesn't seem like that is unsolvable. Why don't we put that one aside? I think we can address that shortly after my arrival. Let's deal with the second issue. And so we went. And I noticed how the mood was changing in the course of the meeting. Initially, the sense was more contentious, more confrontational. Towards the end, there was a sense that we were one and that we were working towards the same end, and many more smiles, feeling much better. And it was my sense that simply listening and trying to analyze or dissect the issue and then offer a solution was really all that was required. And it was tremendously appreciated, evidently. And I took this to mean that that was the paradigm that really needed to be followed going forward. And we did indeed do that as much as we could, as fast as we could, because there were more issues that could be handled in a short period of time. Perhaps one last thing I would say about that is that after 6 to 8 to 9 months, it's hard to say, it seems like we have covered the gamut of the concerns, meaning I would then hear them now in repeat mode. At which point I knew we must have embraced the universe of issues, and I knew probably for the first time something about the scope of the work I needed to do, although the things that the constituencies complained about did not necessarily dictate the body of work that needed to be done, but it had a lot to do with ensuring that the various constituencies feel good about themselves and therefore become active and ideally happy participants in the changes that had to be implemented later. So we are reminiscing here a little bit in a meandering way, but I suppose that's part of the process.
Well, you've covered a bit of how you arrived and the first 6 to 8 months and the broad scope of issues. I'd like to move then from those two very important areas to, okay, you're presented with a broad spectrum of issues on which work was required. What did you decide? What was your method of organization to attack those issues, and kind of why?
I think my tenure was a little different than, let's say, I mean, every tenure is different, but the key difference or the key clarity that I think I had to do with the fact that I was tasked by the corporation and the administration with a very clear series of assignments. A total of 9 or 10 that were clearly spelled out by the corporation after years of study, self-study, external reviews that you were probably part of that preceded my recruitment. In essence, from 2002 to 2004, the corporation, the administration, and the division were all involved in self-study and strategic planning. And the goals or the tasks that were to be accomplished by the dean who would be recruited were all spelled out. So in a sense, I had my recipe. I knew what I had to do. Step number 1 was to reconstitute the leadership team. There was a sense that some, maybe not all, of the leadership team was not up to the task. And so I knew that that was a top priority if we were going to effect the change that the other 8 or 9 items required. Those included, and I may overlook one or two, including an expectation that the medical education curriculum be integrated, that the size of the student body be increased, that the pre-med admission process be tested and codified, if successful, that we see to it that the medical school has a home it can call its own, that the program in public health has a home to call its own, that we rank in the top quartile. That was listed as a goal. And perhaps one or two other tasks that were very explicit that needed to be accomplished during my tenure. And so the broad umbrella or the broad roadmap was very clear. Now, that's not to say that issues didn't come up in rapid succession every day or every week that needed dealing with. And in a sense, the task was to keep up with those while never losing sight of the big picture, which is always easy to do. So you had to constantly focus on recruitment, because if you didn't get that done, the rest couldn't follow. And that marked, I think, certainly the first year, although that's not to say that's the only thing we did, but there was a major focus of the first year. So unlike perhaps other organizations which are viewed by the administration to be in good stead, and in which case what is required is regrouping and strategically planning ahead, there was a sense that there was a substantial amount of fixing that needed to be done, that this was somewhat of a turnaround operation, that there were a lot of things that needed to be dealt with. And so I didn't really, on the one hand, have the need to create my own strategic plan right at the outset, because that was laid out for me. I was the implementer of the plan that was already laid out by the corporation and the administration. Except you know that later on during my tenure, I did produce a strategic plan which guided, I would say, our second phase. In other words, it probably marked the last 2 years of my tenure, I would say, after much of the agenda which I was originally given was being addressed. And that strategic plan, I think, is to some degree still viable and by no means fully executed, but we can talk about elements of it as we think about the future in particular.
So you might, just in terms of then the periods of of your tenure, there was the section from when you arrived in the January of 2005 for the getting acquainted, hearing the issues for the first 6 or 8 months. Then was there a second and third phase that you would describe?
I would say 2 phases really, but I would say that the first phase continued, of course, throughout the 4 years, whereas the second phase kicked in with the formulation of the Dean's strategic plan. Up to that point, we had our hands full with all kinds of issues. And there was really no time to go through it, and more importantly, to attempt to implement it. So I don't think of it as more than 2 phases.
What do you see as some of your early successes and early challenges?
Well, I mentioned one earlier. I was very pleased with the way the graduate student program turned out. Um, it was placed on solid footing, and I think is going fantastic to date. That's not to say that there is no work to be done, and there is work that is being done, but I think that was something I was very pleased with. I was very pleased with my first recruitment, who was Phil Grappuzzo, our Associate Dean for Medical Education. And I was very pleased really with many of the other recruitments. John Deely was my next recruit, and I think Nancy followed suit probably in January of '06, Nancy Thompson. And so it went. I was very pleased with those recruitments and knew that once they were on board and once I communicated with them the general gist of the plan, I could delegate and let them go with it, although with regular contacts that transpired on a weekly basis. But that increasingly freed me up from dealing with issues that I was clearly dealing with at the beginning. A big process about building the team is really about freeing the dean up to focus on strategy, fundraising, and representation. Instead, because there was this so-called turnaround situation, I didn't have that luxury for at least 2 years. There was a tremendous amount of hands-on that at some level is, suboptimal, because you really don't want to do that if you don't have to. But it had to be done. And it taught me a great deal about the fine points and about the process. And it probably exposed me to insight that I wouldn't have otherwise.
Any other early challenges, Ellie?
I mean, nothing probably as significant in scope as we discussed earlier. It was clear to me, and I took that very seriously, that we needed to get a CTSA award as a school, a Clinical Translational Science Award. That crept on us because it was just a concurrence of events. And I felt a tremendous sense of responsibility, but also of concern whether or not we would be able to mount this effort. That's a concern I couldn't share with anybody. I mean, I had to believe in it, and I had to make everybody else believe in it. And so we proceeded with it on that assumption. I convened a dinner meeting at my home to get it all started, invited 20 or 25 individuals from different parts of the organization. And we discussed it and decided essentially to proceed with the planning grant, which was done and was in fact approved, as you know. And that was very encouraging because I was concerned even at that level at the time. Armed with that, we then proceeded to plan the actual application, the full-fledged application, which is still going on, as you know. As I think about it today, I am much more optimistic and much more convinced that we will fare better. There's no guarantee, of course. But responding to your question about challenges, I felt that was a significant challenge and one we had to rise to if we wanted to be the best that we can be, if we wanted to be in the, with the leading edge, if we wanted to be in the top quartile. I would say that was a heavy load that one had to carry because I felt it was very significant for the institution. Nothing terribly dramatic comes to mind in terms of large scope challenges. There was a lot of consistent incremental work towards multiple goals, sometimes with imperceptible progress, but no dramatic challenges that I can think of the magnitude I just described. The operate gift was, of course, a big high, and at some point we can talk about that. That was a wonderful, wonderful time, obviously.
Well, maybe that's a good time to transition into the main portion of your deanship. There's so many issues to discuss. If there's a way in which you'd like to organize it, just to review a bit of the highlights or some of the experiences that were particularly meaningful to you.
An easy way to organize it, Jeff, I think, is to think about the 4 units that make up the division. The medical school, the program in biology, the program in public health, and the hospital-based programs. So starting with the medical school, you recall that several of the tasks I was assigned had to do with the medical school. And really, through the good work of many, led by Phil Grapuzzo, who we mentioned earlier, and some key associates, Alicia Monroe, comes to mind, Luba Dumenko comes to mind, and I'm sure many others who I cannot do complete justice to. Yourself, always very heavily involved in the reorganization, shall we say, of the medical school. We were able to essentially meet the tasks that were set for us by implementing and codifying the pre-med admission process, growing the medical student body that in about a year or two will probably plateau at around 400 students at any given moment. Integrating the curriculum, introducing the doctoring course, introducing the scholarly concentration program, all of which were just critical, I think, to bring the school to its current state. But that's just the beginning, because so much more of it had to do with just the overall sense that the students may have had about the level of engagement on the part of administration, the trust they developed in Phil and hopefully in me, and in Alicia, of course, and so many other good people in the Student Affairs Office. The progressive sense that we care, that we are proactive about things that matter to them, let's say USMLE examinations, changed the tenor in the medical school. At some point it became obvious, although nobody pays attention. But all of a sudden, after I described to you basically a non-stop stream of complaints, there was dead silence, and it was an eerie feeling. Now, granted, maybe some of the complaints were now going somewhere else, but on balance, I still have to say that as I look at the operation of the medical school today, it seems to run smoothly by and large, and increasingly better each and every semester, year, with ongoing improvements. Nothing's beyond improvement. And so there's more of that going on as we speak, needless to say. But it feels like constructing the class of 2012 is not a routine matter, but is now well practiced. And most of us are not losing that much sleep over it as we did probably 3 or 4 years ago. And when we know that we had 11% more applicants than last year, and when we know that the quality of those applicants is just outstanding, and that the matriculation rate is now about 1% for the pre-med track, you actually can, for a little bit anyway, have the luxury of basking in that state of affairs, but hopefully never letting your guard down. And we talked the other day about the challenges of financial aid, among other things, which could change this relatively fragile state. But compared to 2004, I feel there has been a substantial and very measurable improvement. And that doesn't begin to address the online reporting systems, the various organizational elements that had to be introduced, the new advising system. We could go on and on. I think, on balance, I really feel collectively, all of us, perhaps with my instigation, but certainly not due to my sweat, I think we've come a long way, and I think we can be very proud of that. And I do think there will be a medical education building, and I think that's another wonderful thing to be able to say. We now have the money, we now have the will, and I don't think there's any question that it will happen. The only question is now, is it going to be 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now? But it's going to be a reality, and someday, we'll be driving downtown, and there'll be a building that will read Alpert Medical School, which I think is a wonderful thing. So that covers the medical school in a way, although there's always more to say. In the biology program, I think the focus has been mostly on program building and faculty recruitment. I was fortunate to be able to inaugurate a building every single year I was here, essentially. I wasn't here for the shipbuilding, but it really occurred very close to my arrival. In 2005, we purchased the 121 South Main facility, which is and was and is to be the home of the program in public health and eventually the school in public health. Then came the inauguration of the Sidney Frank Hall for Life Sciences in 2006. And throughout really all this time, we were gradually renovating the biomedical center, starting with the educational facilities, which was another plus adding Smith Bonanno, as you probably know, to our educational facilities. But then we went to the basic laboratory space in the biomedical center and renovated one floor at a time. And to date, I think we can say that that building has been entirely renovated. And while the building is not new, the lab space is first rate and is compatible in quality with all the rest of the space in the relatively new building that we purchased or built. The faculty recruitment was probably the most rewarding piece. That was all preordained by the plan for academic enrichment. The expectation was that we would hire 23 new faculty to the biology departments, not counting those that we would recruit because we would replace a retiring faculty or replace a faculty who resigned or moved elsewhere. And I believe, although I cannot probably be precise without my notes on the numbers, that we have probably recruited close to 20 of those 23. So maybe there are 4 or 5 left at this point that would have to be addressed. Being involved with that process was just a wonderful experience. So between the graduate program, which was largely but not exclusively biology, the facilities that we put on the map, the new faculty that we brought on board, which increased the roster to over 100 faculty on campus. And the programs we built in those areas, I think took the program in biology from a particular state to a heightened state, which, again, I am certain has innumerable tangible and intangible influences on how we are perceived, what quality students we attract, and how well organized we are. And that's a general comment I would make. This administration was very keen on professionalism in management. We're not by any means all we want to be, but huge improvements were made, and they have a lot to do with the quality of people we recruited. And credit goes to really all of those individuals who, in their respective areas, brought about excellence and professionalism that I have to assume was noticed. With public health, it was much of the same in the sense that we had to recruit faculty, start new educational programs, and really aim gradually for a process of accreditation of the program so that a school in public health could in fact be established. We were extremely lucky to have 121 South Main be available when it was. It was too good to be true, but it really solved this issue and took it off the map for us. It was one task I had to do, and it was over. It was done. There was a lot to do after that, but the big move was made. Public health faculty worked diligently to create new educational programs, 1 or 2 new PhD programs, have grown the master student body, recruited carefully and meticulously, maybe not as fast as biology, and therefore of the 17 or so faculty that were destined for them, we're probably only approaching 10 at this point. So there's more to be done in terms of recruiting in public health. But the program has grown in leaps and bounds and is wonderfully funded, has a great program project right now, is home to the National Children's Study. And in my opinion, is in a matter of a year or two ready for accreditation, assuming we receive approval from the leadership and from the corporation to do so, which I think we will when the time is right. There are some financial realities that I think would have to be addressed. There are some governance issues that would have to be addressed, but those are all solvable. So with a little bit of luck, in 2011 or 2012 or 2013 at the latest, a ribbon will be cut, a new dean will be in place, and the school will be announced. And that would be the second professional school at Brown, which, if you begin to think about how long it took to get there, you realize it was a much shorter course. There was much less by way of barriers to overcome relative to the medical school, which took a long time to come to fruition. And it's possible that once Brown, accepted the fact that there will be a professional school in its midst, once that one major barrier was crossed, and it was painful at the time, extending that to another professional school was a little more manageable. I don't sense the same level of concern, the same level of opposition that has been described to me, because I wasn't there, of course, when the school was established. Which makes me wonder if the subsequent professional school will fare even better. What that might be, if I had to guess, I would say engineering. But I'm beginning to get into arenas which are probably more the domain of the president than that of the dean of the Division of Biology and Medicine. And finally, the hospitals. As you know, we have here a unique circumstance whereby Brown and its medical school have an educational partnership with 7 hospitals from 3+ hospital systems. So a very diverse population of hospitals that report to different masters and do not report to Brown. The educational partnership we have is a workable one. Like anything else, it's not beyond improvement, but it's a workable one. And I think is broadly accepted. We have addressed some of the concerns in that arena, as you know, by beginning to underwrite some of the teaching by providing funds which were never being provided before, and a pledge to build that up to a point where perhaps we can provide something on the order of $1 million a year to support the educational mission by hospital-based physicians. Where we have not perhaps come as far as I would have liked is in creating a research partnership. In essence, a strategic coordination that would allow us to use our finite resources in a more strategic fashion, in a more coordinated fashion, so that we get to the target, whatever promised land that might be, in a more proficient and more expedited manner. The Dean strategic plan was all about that. It was about a sense of oneness, a sense of groupness. It was about creating an academic health center that's not just physically distinct by dint of proximity, but an academic health center that is programmatically coordinated by having a single research dean for the entirety of the enterprise, by pooling resources into areas of excellence that would jointly be agreed upon and then pursued. But as we speak, that portion of the Dean strategic plan has not materialized, and I think it is likely beholden on the next administration to regroup, reevaluate the relationship sets with the hospitals, and determine what to focus on. There's nothing fatal about the status quo, in the sense that an educational partnership is in place. That's sort of the minimum requirement to have a medical school. And we could evolve along the lines of our friends to the north, wherein the medical school and the hospitals are separate but equal. My ongoing belief is that given our scale, which is much smaller than the Harvard scale, and given the catch-up we still have to accomplish, which is substantial, not pooling forces is not wise, but as I said, not fatal. I hope that going forward, given enlightened leadership on both the medical school and the hospital side, we can revisit this issue. I think right now we are probably at the point where we've had some very good conversations on this possibility, but we still only have an educational partnership. My guess is everybody is more ready for the concepts because they were hammered in for so long now, and I made it a major priority of my administration. But it's not an easy thing to do, and it takes goodwill. And as I said, a certain sense of enlightenment on both sides, a willingness to work together. So I think in the last more than a few minutes, we covered the medical school, the program in biology, the program in public health, and the hospital-based programs. Highlights thereof.
I appreciate your global overview. I was wondering if you might add a bit of, if you've had a chance to think about it, what might be some lessons you'd like to bequeath to those who follow you? What might they be able to learn from your experience?
It's a little difficult to say because I do believe that the experience is very personal. When the last provost transitioned, meaning from Dr. Zimmer to Dr. Kurtzer, there was very little by way of handoff, because I think it's recognized that everybody has to make their own way, has to figure out their own positions. And in fact, coloring someone's opinions with yours can actually slow you down, as I found out during my transition. I did rely somewhat on my predecessor, but that lesson taught me that the best, I mean, there's some key pieces of information that you may want to transmit, but I think the best thing you can do for your successor is move out of the way and let them figure it out on their own, because it's a very personal process. You cannot impart your own opinion or impose your own opinions anyway. And so I know that the judgment that my predecessor had and I had on certain issues or on certain people differed. But I had to work my way back from the impressions he implanted in my mind, which eventually I figured out I didn't entirely agree with. And since it has to work for you, I don't really know that there's a whole lot of lesson imparting. Everybody learns their own lessons. The challenges I went through likely will not recur, or hopefully will not recur, assuming we fix them. There'll be new ones. And everybody has to, I think, figure their way through those.
What would you see as some of the challenges to the medical school, the Division of Biology, Public Health, and the hospitals as we move forward?
I think the medical school is well poised to begin with. I mean, I feel quite good about its present and its future. Tasks that need to transpire on the medical school side, as I said, include but may not be limited to reviewing and reinventing, I would say, the clinical component of the curriculum the last 2 years. I think there's a lot of opportunity there if we have time to do so. There's a lot of consolidation probably still to be done in the first 2 years. There is a lot of consolidation and expansion that needs to happen at the level of the scholarly concentrations and maybe doctoring. There is a clear need in bringing the MD-PhD program to a much more acceptable level, and if at all possible, endow it so that we can afford a first-class program and then apply for matching federal funds so that we have a critical mass of students of high quality who are treated essentially like any other graduate student. We're not there yet. That's a challenge. And of course, we need to get on with planning and building the medical school building. It's a question of implementation now. On the public health side, I think the issues are completing the recruitments so that there is sufficient human capital in all the various corners of the program, which would make them eligible for accreditation. Then going through the accreditation process and hopefully inaugurate one fine day a Brown School for Public Health. The biology program has a little bit of recruiting to do. I think could probably focus more on interdisciplinary projects and program projects as opposed to individual awards. And before too long, participate in planning additional wet lab space, because what we have is largely spoken for. And even though we increased our wet lab space dramatically, we are not going to be able to bring on more investigators going forward unless we increase our research space, most likely in the jewelry district, because, as you know, we all but ran out of space here on the Hill. With the hospitals, it is pretty much along the lines that I spoke to you earlier. To my mind, the idealized scenario would be to strengthen the relationship along research lines, create a research partnership to complement the educational partnership. If that does not transpire, as I said, my sense is that we will have slowed down our progress, diminished our opportunities to move forward in a more vigorous way. But that life will go on, and hopefully the hospitals and Brown will each be successful in their own right. But that would be the separate but equal model. I think that's a reasonable summary of the future that can be foreseen. There's a lot, undoubtedly, that is to be discovered.
And thank you. And maybe finally, are there some stories or experiences or relationships that you felt you would like to mention that come to mind?
I think the one that comes to my mind has to do with my sensitization by Brown and several of its faculty, or maybe resensitization. That would be a more charitable way of characterizing this. My resensitization to social causes and global justice. I suspect I always harbored those feelings, but having been extremely, perhaps excessively focused on my professional career, I did not have all that many opportunities to be involved in good causes. I can clearly feel how my tenure at Brown has changed that in terms of my current involvement, but perhaps even more importantly and potentially my future involvement. As I think about what next, that's clearly one of the options I'm considering, be it reproductive global health or other issues that are near and dear to me, and that I would like to find a way to be of utility to. That remains to be seen, but I must say that that part of my tenure, which probably was more likely to happen at Brown than anywhere else, is one I'm very grateful for. I'm very pleased with, and hope to put to good use.
Anything further that you would like to add, Tina Dashi?
Well, it's a nice closure to a journey that you were involved with, that you helped inaugurate in a way. I still remember our first and second meetings very well, and not to mention our third, I believe, a dinner at the faculty club. And this is a nice way to, I think, close that circle with reflections on the way we were and the way things will be. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And I want to thank Dean Eliadashi and the film crew for the opportunity to participate in the archival interview for Dean Eliadashi at the Arnold Laboratories, Brown University, June 16th, 2008. Thank you.